Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Grant Maxwell is the author of Integration and Difference, Constructing a Mythical Dialectic, a book which confronts the perennial problem of opposition in philosophy with respect to the notions of integration and difference. This is a robust work which covers many figures in philosophy, from Hegel to William James to Isabel Stegners, but for our purposes today, we will delve into the sections of the book that specifically talk about the relationship between Deleuze and American archetypal psychologist James Hillman. And it is likely that we will bring in the work of Schelling, Bergson, and Carl Jung as important mediators in that work. One of the problems that I would like to confront today is the role of myth, image, and imagination as it pertains to this work. And I just want to say right off at the start, I think it's very surprising in some ways that Deleuze and Hillman didn't seem to cross paths. And in as much as there's many convergences and overlaps in this work, I think we'll find out that there's important differences and maybe even points of contention between these two thinkers. But without further ado, I want to introduce our guest, Grant Maxwell. Grant, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, guys. As I mentioned earlier, I really appreciate the work you guys do on this podcast. So I'm really happy to be here talking with you today.
We appreciate your appreciation. I think that most of our listenership has at least a cursory understanding of the work of Gilles Deleuze, but far fewer are probably familiar with the work of James Hillman. And perhaps one of the ways that we can get to know you, Grant, is how is it that you came across the work of James Hillman? Do you have any practical experience through psychoanalysis? I actually went to Jungian psychoanalysis for a bit, but then I'm just curious, like, once you encountered Deleuze or Hillman and Deleuze, at which point did you notice this convergence? Because I certainly did. And what drove you to write a book about it?
So one of the first books of philosophy that I read after I took a course in undergrad on just an intro to philosophy, where we read Plato and Nietzsche and Augustine and things like that. And then I was working in a bookstore. I was in college in Austin in the late 90s, Austin, Texas. And I was working in a bookstore over the summer, and I was just browsing in the philosophy section, and I came across this book called The Passion of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas. And so I read that book, and that's the book that really got me excited about philosophy. And it's a really good introduction, pretty accessible. I mean, it's large and as comprehensive as you can be in one volume, but it's a great book. And so a few years, that started getting me really interested in philosophy. And then I moved to New York and went to grad school in the early 2000s. And I was actually in an English PhD program. And we were reading a lot of French theorists. I was taking classes devoted to Derrida and Foucault. And so that's when I became interested I reread Passion of the Western Mind. And I reached out to Rick Tarnas, and we sort of formed a friendship. He kind of became a mentor of mine. And he was a student of Hillman's. Hillman was one of his primary mentors. And so he teaches at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. He's actually the founding director of the philosophy program there. So as I was going through my program where we were mostly reading post-structuralist theorists, I took a class that was largely devoted to Haraway and Donna Haraway, and I took a few classes with a scholar of William James, who was in the comp lit department, but she was a scholar of William James and Henry James. Joan Richardson, she wrote A Natural History of Pragmatism, which is a great book. And I took a few classes in the philosophy department there. And I also flew out to California a few times and took some summer intensives with Rick Tarnas. There was a class on Freud, Jung, and Nietzsche that was great. He talked about Hillman a lot. That was really my introduction to Hillman. So the foundations of my interest in philosophy are really intertwined with depth psychology, with Jung and Hillman, because at the same time I was reading them over the last few decades, I was also reading James, Bergson, Whitehead, Hegel. And after reading those post-structuralist theorists in grad school in the mid 2000s, I felt an affinity with Derrida especially, but I also was really feeling like I wanted to rebel against his negative affective position, his sort of refusal or effacement of any larger coherence or of any meta narrative. Of course, that's Lyotard. Postmodernism is a what is it? A refusal of meta narratives or a incredulity against meta narratives. And that's one thing that the Passion of the Western Mind really confirmed for me, that postmodernism, he framed postmodernism as this, he calls it an interregnum between worldviews. So it's sort of like a clearing of the stage after modernity, a deconstruction of the fundamental assumptions that have constituted the logocentric epoch. I wrote a dissertation on music that's informed by a lot of these thinkers, and that I published that as my first book, which is called How Does It Feel? And then I wrote another book, it's a short work of, it's sort of leans in a popular direction, called The Dynamics of Transformation. And that was published in 2017. And that sort of summed up in a concise way what I had learned and thought of so far. And then after I published that book, I was really, that book did pretty well. And I was thinking, what do I do next? How do I take my thinking to the next level? How do I push myself to go beyond what I've already understood? And so at the time I was, this was sort of at the peak of Jordan Peterson's influence, about maybe like 6 years ago, maybe at this point. And I was just getting really frustrated with Peterson, because not only because of, his misogyny, but also especially because I think he badly misappropriates Jung. He just doesn't understand Jung very well. At the time, a lot of people were associating Jung with Peterson and saying, oh, we have to reject Jung because Peterson is this sort of vaguely, right-wing, flirting with the right-wing kind of figure. I wrote an article about him, just sort of briefly laying out what I discerned as his misogyny. And then one thing that he always rails against, Peterson does, is he calls it, postmodern neo-Marxism or something. That's his great enemy. And it's this completely manufactured, constructed entity that doesn't really exist as this unified identity in reality.
It's a Jungian shadow figure.
Exactly. It's a projection. Exactly. And so I was thinking, I had kind of set postmodernism aside and even been reacting against it in the form of especially Derridian deconstruction, even though I still admired Derrida. But the fact that Peterson was so against postmodernism made me think, maybe I should give it another chance. And so I had been hearing about Deleuze and Guattari for years. Since grad school, I'd read a little bit of Anti-Oedipus, and honestly, at the time, I was a little turned off by the sort of the potty stuff going on, the very transgressive stuff. But I just thought it was a little silly. But then I decided to pick up What is Philosophy, and so that's the first book I read by Deleuze and Guattari, and I loved it. And then after that, I read Difference and Repetition, which I really loved.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. Which, is, if I had to pick one favorite book at this point, it's probably Difference and Repetition. I think it used to be, I think it probably used to be Process and Reality, and it's still by Whitehead, but that's.
And Deleuze has a lot of problems with that book for himself, which you point out in your book, I believe.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, yes, but I think that he, as most theorists, I think, are a little bit embarrassed about their earlier work and feel like their later work is, solved some of the problems that they didn't address in their earlier work. But I think he's a little too humble, actually. but then he does say that it was a beginning that sort of opened up certain lines of thought for him and sort of shook him out of something. It was some stasis that he felt he was in. But then later he said, I think it was in the American preface to A Thousand Plateaus, I think, he says that was the seed of all of his later work, both with and without Guattari. And so then from there, what I realized is that, I just over the last, half decade or so, I read all of Deleuze's books and I read a lot of his influences. And what I realized is that he is constructivist, whereas Derrida is almost exclusively deconstructivist. If you can, I don't know if that's a word that one would want to use, but this goes back to Schelling's distinction between negative and positive philosophy, which it's the negative philosophy is primarily critical. It problematizes, it analyzes, and Derrida isn't specifically critical, but his primary project is to problematize the texts that he reads. And so I've actually since come to really appreciate Derrida a lot more. I ended up reading quite a bit more Derrida over the last few years. And it sort of in that context, to me, I think of him as sort of like this figure almost like Moses, that he led his people out of bondage, but he wasn't able to enter into this novel promised domain. And I think of him and Deleuze as Derrida and Deleuze as sort of like the two faces of Janus, that Derrida is looking back toward the past and he's trying to liberate thought from the constraints of logocentric rationality. And Deleuze, although there are some very critical aspects of his work in relation to, especially in relation to Hegel and in relation to Freud and the Oedipal. But I think those things have tended to be emphasized by Deleuze scholars, I think, to bring it more into resonance with sort of that the tendency toward problematizing that's characteristic of post-structuralism, whatever that may be. But I think the overwhelming trajectory of his work is positive. It posits novel metaphysical entities and conceptions.
Yeah, and before I forget, I have it on very, very good information that James Hillman absolutely hated Derrida. One of my mentors actually was in Zurich at the time that James Hillman was there, and they became very good friends, and they did stuff in the United States when everyone came back. And Hillman is said to have said, I don't know what it is about that guy, but I absolutely can't stand him.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm 57% Jewish, and I think that it may have something to do with they're sort of the same generation. They're two very prominent Jewish intellectuals, and I think it was almost a little too close to home. But they're sort of opposite
interesting
in their perspective. Because Hillman, of course, Hillman can get a little bit critical and a little bit. He doesn't let us rest on any stable certainties, of course, but he's combative too. Yeah, he is, and transgressive. I was really wondering, as I was preparing for this book, I was looking through Hillman's work and wondering if he had ever encountered Deleuze, because I think he would have actually really resonated with Deleuze, even though he was sort of critical of Derrida and Foucault. And he doesn't seem to have read him, but of course, Deleuze's work wasn't translated as early as the work of Derrida and Foucault. So that probably has something to do with it.
Well, before we get to Adam's question, I want to get some distinct clarity about James Hillman. Imagine you're trapped in an elevator for 5 minutes with somebody and said, hey, I know you've written on James Hillman. Who is this guy and why is his work important?
So to me, Hillman is the most interesting and important post-Jungian. A lot of Jungians have sort of simplified Jung's writing. I mean, Jung was this pioneering figure who wrote over 6 or 7 decades. He wrote he wrote a lot, he spoke a lot, he created a lot of concepts, and he often contradicted himself and revised his concepts. And by the end of his career, he was pushing his thinking, I think, into deeper and more subtle territories. Whereas, I think I admire someone like, for instance, Joseph Campbell, who I admire him particularly as a sort of popularizer who's mostly speaking to, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just mean that he's primarily speaking to a popular audience and bringing these Jungian, and he has some a lot of interesting things to say. But the thing that Jung always eschewed was sort of this conception of the archetypes as these sort of fixed categories, these pre-existing categories that you could just divide everything up into. He was just constantly pushing against this conception. And so I think what Hillman does is, he was born, I think, a year after Deleuze in Atlantic City. And he actually underwent analysis with Jung in Zurich and became the I think director of programs at the association, the Central Jungian School is there. And to me, he's the most sophisticated, complex, difficult academic Jungian. What he does is he and I'm telling you of course things that you already know. But
but of course our listeners probably haven't heard this, and it's good to hear it from somebody different than myself.
What he does is he reverses the privileging of literalism, of literal physical causality, efficient causality over fantasy, imagination. And what he says is that reality is metaphorical across scale, which I think is really resonant with what Deleuze and Guattari say in A Thousand Plateaus, that all signs are signs of signs. That every mode of thought, including sort of literalist, reductive materialism and scientific rationality, it's a fantasy. It's a narrative construction that privileges certain aspects of reality, and in the case of exclusivist rationality, it defines itself by disqualifying non-modern, non-Western modes of thought. So Hillman sort of problematizes that hierarchical privileging in a way that's quite resonant with deconstruction, actually, I think there are actually a lot of similarities between Hillman and Derrida in terms of their sense of clever wordplay and their focus on pushing the etymology of words to extremes. But what's really interesting is that I was going to say that Hillman is primarily positive, but he's not always effectively positive. I mean, he also asks us to dwell with negative affect as well. That he really critiques, for instance, sort of that sort of West Coast, which I'm from the West Coast, so I'm allowed to talk about this. But that sort of West Coast spirituality that's sort of this sanitized, reduced form of Buddhist spirituality that's sort of like climbing the rungs of transcendental meditation to attain perfect wholeness and oneness. And in a very similar way to what Deleuze and Guattari are doing, and Deleuze by himself, Hillman really wants to problematize this idea that we can attain a perfect totalizing wholeness and reconciliation and oneness, that there are always oppositions and conflicts and slippages and discordances that can never be completely resolved.
Yeah, actually, I had a question about this very notion of potentiality, because I think one of the I'm guessing you're asking about what the central problematic of the book is, because what I quite like is this, the reason why it seems like you're focusing on Jung and Hillman is this particular turn to myth, and the return to myth as a kind of positive, but not positivist. You're not rigid fixing down of these archetypes, but this new positive space in which we can discover these new parts of our sort of philosophical as well as, you know, pre-philosophical experience. And I wanted to ask a question about sort of what the central problematic is in terms of integration and difference in relation to this move into myth, because it seems to me like a lot of it comes back to this particular break between Schelling and Hegel, the idea of this totalizing rational system that maps out the contours of all the oppositions of thought, all that they can produce, and all the oppositions that held within everything thinkable, and how we commune with the thinkable, as in Hegel's system, particularly the later system of the encyclopedia. And then you have this Schellingian move where he says that, you know, this is all negative philosophy. We usually go into this pre-philosophical, but nonetheless experiential, you know, what Schelling would call a dark ground, where these metaphysically ambiguous sort of entities that could be gods or essences are not fully captured by any totalizing system of thought, but instead there's a new system that we're led into. So I guess that to summarize, so how does mythology map onto this idea of a new dimension to a dialectic beyond purely opposition or ways that opposition is not exhausted in dialectical thinking? It seems like the problematic to me is a little bit kind of like a map versus territory distinction, where you have the Hegelian mapping, and then we have this sort of nomadic sense undergirding it that follows on from, say, Schelling's theory of dark ground, or Schelling's theory of mythology, all the way up to Deleuze-Guattari's characterization of nomadology, and of course the ambiguity of mythology and the ambiguity of the gods and the dramatics they play in our, say, unconscious in the work of Hillman and Jung.
So I don't know if you guys were able to get to the section where I'm discussing the relation between Deleuze and Hegel. That's kind of the one main thing I push against in Deleuze, is although I ultimately agree with his critique of Hegel, that, you know, Hegel in the Science of Logic, he calls the dialectic the one true method, that you have these opposites that exist in this tension by tarrying with the negative, and that they ultimately produce this reconciled identity. But I actually think that Deleuze goes a little too far in his critique of Hegel. And I think I see Hegel as an opening from the rationalist oppositionality characteristic of the Enlightenment that I think is still dominant in analytic philosophy, where you have opposed schools of thought and they engage in logical combat, and one side is vanquished and the other emerges triumphant. And it's sort of like this either or opposition. And so I see Hegel as this opening to the possibility that there can be partial truth in any oppositional formulation. And of course, Hegel took this idea initially from Schelling, or they even developed it together in their early work before the phenomenology of spirit, because they were university roommates. And even though Hegel was 5 years older than Schelling, he was initially sort of considered his supporter, because Schelling published a system of transcendental idealism. And I think a large part of it was that Schelling had the funding to have a journal, a philosophy journal. And so Hegel was kind of beholden to him, because he was basically supporting Hegel, and Hegel was writing for this journal. And so he was supporting Schelling. But then, of course, when he wrote the Phenomenology of Spirit, then there's that sort of implicit critique of Schelling and the night in which all cows are black, which, you know, it's still, there's still debate about whether he actually meant it as a critique of Schelling or just a critique of certain interpretations of Schelling's work, because he doesn't explicitly mention Schelling. So I think that Hegel at that moment surpassed Schelling in his mode of exposition. He was able to express the dialectic that it wasn't just the Hegelian dialectic. It had been developed through the lineage, you know, the post-Kantian lineage from Fichte and Schelling. And I think he expressed, he wrote the composed the peak expression of the dialectic. And so that's why it's become called the Hegelian dialectic. And so I think that kind of, I think that was a great blow to Schelling, to see his former supporter surpass him. But then also his wife died, which he was really difficult for him. And so he published the essay on human freedom in 1809, 2 years after Schelling did, 2 years after Hegel published the Phenomenology of Spirit, which, a lot of people, I think that's a really interesting work, and but a lot of people, even Heidegger thinks that's sort of his masterpiece. And I don't agree. I think that it still hasn't broken away from, it's sort of feeling its way past this sort of monumental totalizing construction of the dialectic, but it doesn't quite get there. And I think Schelling really gets there in his Berlin lectures in the 1840s. So it's like 3 decades later. In Berlin, it's after Hegel's death. So he never really engaged directly he never really criticized Hegel publicly. So like he gave a lecture where he criticized Hegel once when he was alive, but he waited until after Hegel died to really criticize him. But then these Berlin lectures, there are 3 lectures, but there are 2 that I talk about in the book, which is the grounding of positive philosophy, which I think you're engaged with, and where he really goes deeply into this distinction between negative and positive philosophy. And of course, positive, it is affectively positive, but it's also positing novel metaphysical constructions. And I think where that really comes to fruition is in the series of lectures, which is the historical critical introduction to the philosophy of mythology, where Schelling carefully goes through all of the explanations that have been offered since antiquity for mythology, and for the ideology of mythology, and for the sort of ontological status of the gods and heroes of mythology. And so he crosses all the different explanations off the list. Are the gods mere poetic invention of Homer, or are they figures that just simply symbolize natural processes, or are they real humans who are elevated to divine status? What he ultimately comes to is that there's truth in all of these explanations, but the reality of the gods of mythology is more profound and ambiguous than that. And Jason Wirth, who's the editor of that series of lectures, he says that it's one of the most audacious claims of the 19th century that the gods are real, but their ontological status their ontological status is ambiguous. The one explanation that I left out is that there are these divine beings who exist in a transcendent domain of Olympus. And so he's saying there's truth in all of these constructions, but the reality of the gods is that they are potencies, which is a term that he talks a lot about in the grounding of positive philosophy, which potency comes from the Latin potens, it's potentia, potential, power, potency. And so they're powers. They're the powers and forces of, it's what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as cosmic forces, dynamisms. And even in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze says that Schelling's most important contribution is his theory of powers. And he doesn't specifically refer to this, the introduction to the philosophy of mythology, but I think that's what he has in mind, because he talks about the gods a lot in Difference and Repetition. He brings these into conversation, and it's often really difficult to understand what he means when he's talking about the gods and where he's locating these gods. And I think that's wise, because ultimately what I'm getting at is that I think that Jung's late conception of the archetypes, which was carried forward by Hillman, is very closely resonant with Schelling's conception of potencies, and even with a lot of Deleuze. I mean, Deleuze is so interesting. I mean, one reason why he's so interesting is because he would always change his vocabulary from book to book. He would just create new concepts to get sort of at the same types of ideas, but he would use new words. He does use the word archetype at various points, like in Proust and Science. He positively employs the word archetype. As early as that article from Sacker, Masoch to Masochism, that was translated by Christian Kerslake. He talks positively about Jung. There's that really striking endnote in Difference and Repetition where he basically says that Jung's project of differentiation, which is sort of like, to me, the central project of Difference and Repetition, it is that's more profound than Freud's project, basically. I can't remember the exact formulation, but so he basically affirms a very strong resonance between his work and that of Jung. And that really hasn't been very emphasized by Deleuze scholars. So I'm glad we're going to talk about it today and maybe start to help change that a little bit.
This is a perfect spot to pick up one of the topics that I wanted to talk about, and it's this notion of archetypes. You're probably familiar with the essay by James Hillman, Psychology, Monotheistic or Polytheistic.
Yeah.
And this is where I see the convergence between Schelling and Hillman, where actually, I mean, there's a real historical precedent for why it's the case we don't think polytheistically or pantheistically. I mean, primarily because the Romans, via their form of Christianity, sought to stomp out or appropriate or overcode all of these pantheistic expressions. And what we see in Hillman is a psychologizing of that maneuver. You've mentioned the late Carl Jung. And one of the things that Hillman struggles against, and actually, I don't think we really find this out from Hillman until he talks about his encounter with Jung's The Red Book, where we see this late iteration of Jung's notion of the archetype, which seems to move more closely to the criticism that Hillman deploys, which is, look, what we're trying to get at with our investigation or interrogation of images, in order for us to feel lively and have these images do the work that they themselves want to do, is we need to move away from these symbological reductions or these typological reductions and move to a kind of polyvalent understanding of the image. I mean, maybe I've already said the answer here, but perhaps we could unpack that. Like, what does Jung do in his late version of recasting the archetypes that Hillman does as well? And that might jibe with what Deleuze does with the word archetype.
Yeah, I mean, I think the person who's been most influential on my thinking about this subject is Rick Tarnas, who talks about basically how in Jung's middle period, he tended to talk about the archetypes as organizing categories of the mind, as sort of intrinsic to the human psyche, and they're categories that were developed over the course of evolution. And by his later work, he was thinking of them more as organizing principles of reality itself. But I think especially by Mysterium Conjunctionis in his late work on alchemy, which he wrote in his 80s, I think he was thinking of it in a more rhizomatic than arborescent way. So that the archetypes aren't these transcendent objective. They're not the Platonic forms of which the things in actuality are sort of an attenuated degeneration. They're these relational nodes or complexes of meaning and form that are operative, that find expression on every scale, but there's no. It recedes toward to use a Deleuzian term, it recedes infinitely toward a dark or obscure precursor. You never encounter say Chronos himself. You always encounter him in terms of his, in relation to his infinite regress of masks and disguises. And so I think this is what Hillman really draws out, that the psyche is not only inhabited by, but composed of this multiplicity of voices, of persons, of ontologically ambiguous persons that can be figured as gods, or they can be figured in the mode of animism as spirits, or they can be figured in any number of imaginal constructions. And so I think Jung tended to focus more on monotheism, and on, like in Aeon, he really focuses on the Christ archetype, and in relation to alchemy, which of course was a huge part of alchemy in the Middle Ages. But by Mysterium Conjunctionis, he was always sort of pushing toward this polycentric mode of consciousness rather than the monocentric mode of consciousness characteristic of monotheism. And that's something that Hillman really takes up from him. And Hillman is pretty critical of monotheism and of that monocentric mode of consciousness. The egoic mind and the egoic self, lowercase self instead of the uppercase self of Jungian individuation, has been forged by projection into this monotheistic, the central totalizing monotheistic divinity. And it's been a necessary, Deleuze and Guattari, I think, call it the bionivocal relation. It's dual, but it's univocal. It's one voice, but expressed dually between God and ego. But then the problem becomes that the ego becomes too dominant in the internal psychic milieu, and it represses all of the other voices that compose us.
Yeah. And that's a very sort of Nietzschean view of monotheism. And I think Klasowski does a good job of sort of giving us concepts to work with that, which of course Deleuze and Guattari kind of borrow from themselves there. It's interesting. I just want to add something to this discussion before maybe I pass it to Adam that will give, I don't know, maybe some color to the concepts. What got me to read the work of James Hillman was actually, I lived in Japan, I lived overseas, and I was just having nightmare after nightmare. And I did, like, to the point that, like, I had no interest in that stuff at all. The nightmare sent me to the books. I got on Amazon or whatever at the time, and I had to figure this out. And it's interesting because the very dream that sent me into psychoanalysis and to look at Hillman's works has a very sort of Deleuzian character to it. And I didn't encounter Deleuze until much later. In one of the dreams, there was a woman named Diana, and she was pushing a lawnmower over a field of long grass. And grass, as we know, is a rhizome. And Diana is, of course, an iteration of Dionysus. And it's interesting, in the vision, she was weakened as she was mowing the lawn. And so it's interesting. I bring it into focus because the image of Diana that we see in my dream is one that it's not like a one-to-one correspondence with the mythical image of Diana. You have this conflation of, I'm mowing this lawn at this estate. It's in a modern time, and this woman, and she looks very pale on an old Sears Craftsman lawnmower kind of thing. You have this sort of mix-up, and I guess you would say a bricolage of images which reveal the archetypes as a kind of set of confused, but in a good way, coordinates, to the extent that there's humor, there's irony, there's interplay, there's evolution. And I think this is one of the ways that Hillman wanted us to see the archetypes, where they aren't these strict, reified, bounded notions of image, but they're very porous. They have directions. There's things leaping off of them. And I'm curious, did you ever do any dream work or anything like that, or try to apply these concepts to any of the sort of work you do with music or creativity?
Yeah, I mean, I've gone to lots of different various, retreats. I did, for instance, a week of holotropic breathwork with Stanislav Grof at Omega Institute in upstate New York, who he's, you probably know given the name of your podcast, he's one of the primary researchers on LSD psychotherapy. He was doing, work at in Baltimore and then at Esalen Institute. And he's actually one of Rick Tarnas's primary mentors as well. Holotropic breathwork is sort of like it's a way of inducing psychedelic states of consciousness without psychoactive compounds. Although he's not against the use of psychoactives, although he does want us to be careful when using that. I think of sort of Esalen Institute and the California Institute of Integral Studies as they're almost like the Harvard and Yale of the alternative sort of Jungian academia. And then there's Pacific Graduate Institute, which is like really based on Hillman's work. So I've been around a lot of people who are really engaging in work on psychedelics and on spirituality and meditation and various kinds of mysticism. I've gone to retreats at Esalen and things like that. And so my parents are cool old hippies, and so
I'm putting the pieces together in real time.
Yeah, I grew up with my mom. Casts the I Ching and is really into Jung, and she's a writer, and my dad was really into shamanism for a while. So it's like I kind of grew up with all this kind of stuff, and then moved to New York City and got really into this sort of edgy post-structuralist stuff, and now I've kind of come full circle back around to seeing the deep value in these modes of thought, but also I'm trying to sort of bring these modes that have kind of been excluded from academia into more resonance with academic work. So yeah, I've done my share of psychedelic explorations. And, I was just thinking about this earlier. I'm sure you guys have encountered this too, that people who do psychedelics or who consider themselves spiritual, it doesn't necessarily make you a better person.
Could make you worse.
Yeah. Those people can often be the most self-centered people. And what it really is that these practices, whether it's, the shamanic techniques of ecstasy, whether it's, fasting, wilderness exposure, dance, vocalization, or, holotropic breathwork, or ingestion of various psychoactive compounds, they're tools, they're instruments that can be used well or badly. And, so I think a lot of people who take psychedelics, it actually can at first inflate one's ego. And I think a lot of people get stuck there and they become egomaniacs. Alternately, it can dissolve your ego, and to the point where you can barely function in reality. So it's really about, there's danger in psychedelics. That's why can be so transformative. So you really have to sort of walk that line, because it can take you to some dark places as well as some really, really transcendent places.
Yeah. So there's a risk of getting, I guess, what I'd like to call a Crowley complex of kind of egomania when it comes to psychedelia. Cards on the table, I did my master's thesis on mythology of alcoholism and Dionysus in Hegel's theory of times. This is very much like tapped into and of course you have the dope smoker behind me, which is not quite as psychedelic, but there's an odyssey character to it. Magical sounds, magic with a capital K, I'll say, kind of mode. There's a couple of quotes actually, Gerard, can you unpack for us actually? Because there's one quote I really loved from chapter 12 on Hillman, which is, "The task of human existence is to choose at which level to express the dramatic interweavings of the gods that constitutes us." And there's kind of this aura around this idea of like a democracy of the self, or psychology being a kind of, it has that sort of invocationary property, or a kind of a psychedelia having an invocationary property that borders a little bit on the chaos magical in some ways, but ultimately is this going back to this very not only Jungian but also Schellingian idea of what is the truth behind these mysteries, even if we can be a scientific reductionist about it, but they were still reacting to something. This is Bataille's point. It's like, even if God wasn't there, his absence is still very much powering most of our experiences of ourselves in the interior level. So I just wanted to ask, could you unpack this idea of invocation, depersonalization, the idea of the gods, the kind of dramatic force that we can have to interact with really in this positive way before we get into this rational reductive mode of thinking.
I mean, so to me, this really, you have to go back to Spinoza. And Spinoza doesn't talk about polytheism really at all, but of course he was one of Deleuze's primary influences. And so I think in a lot of ways, Deleuze really integrates Spinoza's work on the affects with this sort of Schellingian and Nietzschean polytheistic mode of thought, and Jungian, of course. I think Deleuze has these two books on Spinoza. And the common interpretation of Spinoza is that he's a complete determinist, and that basically we're just acting out our predetermined roles, that every movement is predetermined. And I think after having read those, couple books on Deleuze and numerous essays, and he talks about Spinoza all the time. The conclusion that I've come to about Spinoza is that it's not that simple, and that what Spinoza is saying is that the affects are determined, and the affects are the formal potencies, which we could associate with the archetypes. And so there are these affective conceptual complexes that demand expression through us. So, and Deleuze talks about it as, in Difference and Repetition, he says, the god of love or the god of anger, and that they're required in order to have an idea, and that these are potencies that demand expression. But what we have is what Spinoza calls a freedom of mind, to choose at which register to express these ontologically ambiguous affective conceptual potentialities. It seems clear from reading Deleuze's biography that he actually had quite Oedipal relationship with his father. And this is something that people have noticed in Francois Daus's large dual biography of Deleuze and Guattari, and some people have criticized him for it. I think that I go on about this at length in the book, but I think that basically what it comes down to is that, yes, Deleuze had an Oedipal relation to his father, but rather than disqualifying his work in Anti-Oedipus with Guattari, that's actually the affective theoretical complex that motivated him to compose the great work against the Oedipal. So he could, instead of just acting out this Oedipal complex as your typical adolescent rebellion, which I'm sure he probably did that too when he was younger, but instead of just acting it out, and what Deleuze says is that kind of repetition, it just fades away as soon as it's enacted, whereas the higher order of repetition is conserved and maintained because it adds something new to that affective complex. And just a side note, which is interesting, is that Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, says that Deleuze and Guattari basically inherited this critique of the Oedipal from Jung, and he sort of marshals that as a critique of Jung and Deleuze in favor of Freud. But I think that's true. So anyway, to get back to your point, to your question.
Well, just actually, it's a clarificatory thing, just on that idea of an anti-Oedipal complex. Are you saying sort of, because typically the sort of Hegelian response to anything that's defined negatively in that way is, in defining it negatively, you are doing a generic repetition of it because it is fully defining your action. In that sense, are you saying that the particular way in which Deleuze is anti-Oedipal introduces a new kind of repetition that isn't this typical dialectical repetition of you define yourself against this thing and therefore you completely replicate it? Is this differential repetition you think happens in Anti-Oedipus?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think he's expressing. I think we have to express these these archetypal complexes one way or another. They are the will, and they demand to be expressed. And we can't choose our affects. We can't choose whether we experience anger or sadness or joy, but we can cultivate these affects by choosing at which register to express them. So that's where our freedom lies. So it's similar to Nietzsche. He created a huge amount of novelty, not only in his positive concepts, but in his figuring himself as the Antichrist. Nietzsche's father was a pastor. He was from a very devout family. He was devout until the age of 20, when he started to rebel against Christianity. And so there's this sense of by not just merely rebelling against the Christianity of his father, he was able to use this tension of opposites to create something that exceeded that mere opposition. I think that's what Deleuze does so well with Hegel, is that he uses Hegel as this foil. He becomes the negative of Hegel, which is it's this paradoxical operation where he's critiquing the Hegelian negative, but enacting sort of a differential repetition of the conceptual persona of Hegel himself. But out of this paradoxical situation, he says, Deleuze says that paradox is the pathos or the passion of philosophy, and that every concept is bound to be a paradox. So he's putting himself in this paradoxical situation, and out of that is emerging so many, just this proliferation of great concepts, multiplicity and assemblage, with schizoanalysis, with Guattari, and the axiomatics, and just all of these fascinating concepts that he creates.
I think one of the readings of Deleuze and Guattari that we should stay close to is the idea of the rhizome, that even the figure of Hegel that Deleuze rails against is part of this sort of rhizomatic series. It's not something that's completely we've crushed it. He's out of the rhizome. It's not quite like that. And I think, and Deleuze, interestingly, had a position on this, when it came to homosexuality or queer identities, is that even within the rhizome, even though in our society today, the sort of straight cis het identity has been the one to which all others have been subsumed, that gets put into the rhizome. It's not completely deactivated. And Deleuze even goes on to say that, well, even those who are homosexual or queer or what have you, you are a little bit straight too sometimes, right? Because we traverse all of these points within the rhizome. It's not that he wants to have one to the exclusion of the other.
Hegel as a foil is very much, I noticed you referenced quite a bit the essay of, I guess my mentor in a sense, Catherine Malibu, about the one or several wolves. And that is, he has to be this point of almost like the Schellingian identity point, the ultimate he is big identity in order for him to bounce off of this.
It's sort of like she calls him the heteron. He's this sort of ultimate adversary, the accursed exceptional one. He's the enemy of the pack of the thinkers of difference. And so Hegel inhabits this very, very special place, this very particular place in Deleuze's work, where his very relation to Hegel is best explained by means of the Hegelian dialectic as a negation of the Hegelian dialectic. But through that paradoxical operation, he's opening the Hegelian dialectic to a deeper form of dialectic. That's where I got the subtitle of the book from. It's Constructing a Mythical Dialectic. And there's that section in Difference and Repetition where he's talking about Plato and the Phaedrus, and he says that, it's the Statesman, I think. What's one of those? Anyway, and he's going through this series of this method of division of the Platonic Socratic dialectic, where they're just dividing. I think it's the Statesman. Anyway, they're dividing these concepts, or I think they're roles or something like that, their professions or something, into finer and finer oppositions. But then there's this introduction of myth into the dialectic, which integrates he says that Plato integrates myth into the dialectic, and that this is a dialectic of existence. It's a deeper form of dialectic that Deleuze says is the eternal return of Nietzsche, which is interesting because Nietzsche never really said positively what the eternal return was. He intimated it in a negative way. He cleared space for the eternal return. And so I think the eternal return, the concept of the eternal return is as much Deleuze as Nietzsche's. So it's sort of like a collaboration between them. And so that's what the mythical dialectic is. It's the eternal return. And I think it's the method of dramatization where you're dramatizing these different, sometimes divine personalities within an individual, the milieu of an individual psyche, which is deeply resonant with the Jungian psychodramatics and with Hillmanian personifying. And what's the other one? What's the other term? He has those four terms in Revisiting Psychology, where it's anyway, it's personifying and bringing these. Oh, see, here's the truck is going by. Is that gonna show up?
That's all right. Oh, there we go.
It's a concrete truck going right up.
He's just big upping us from the road. He's like, go acid rising. So.
Yeah, exactly. They're like
the concrete versus the abstract. There we go.
Right, yeah. It's kind of like being in New York City, where like under a subway or one of those elevated subway lines, and every time they go by, you can't hear a word that anyone's saying.
One of the things I'd really like to hear more about is this method of dramatization. I mean, this is why I really like sort of the conceptual need you put forward for this kind of dramatization is very much summarized in sort of the closing parts of your chapter on Hillman. The idea that I'll just read this quote out because I think it's lovely. So Hillman evokes the recognition by Schelling that the nominalist project of depersonifying and demythologizing creates the need for words to describe the reality taken for granted prior to this negating movement, so that the reductive conception of allegorical personification depends upon the negation of the originary positing of human consciousness with mythical persons. And I guess we talk about sort of could you sort of give like an example of how we would have this activity of dramatization? So I'm reducing it to somewhat to sort of my favorite sort of mythological figures in pop culture. I love Alan Moore, for example, who has this idea of if gods are real, they exist in human minds, and therefore they have a potency, they have an efficacy there. And that's what how would we explain or illustrate maybe this process of dramatization, maybe in the therapeutic context or even in the kind of a political context, because of course there are political mythologies as much as there are sort of mental or subconscious ones.
Right. I mean, I think it's deeply resonant. This method of dramatization is deeply resonant with Jungian active imagination. The figures in dreams, for instance, are expressing different voices in one's psyche, although Hillman has this great section where he talks about how it's not just that the persons are within our psyche, but that these persons aren't within our dream, but our dream is also encompassed in the relationality of these persons. I think the way you can engage with these others is through, in those all those modes of thought that exceed linear monocentric rationality. So whether it's, in a psychedelic context or in the mode of naming the different affects that compose us within a therapeutic context. I think in the 50s, Northrop Frye did a lot of work on Jungian analyses of literature, and that really went out of fashion with the dominance of new criticism and then of the sort of French literary theory. But I think there's a lot of room. I think that's why I was drawn to English instead of philosophy in the first place, is because you're exploring the modes of narrativity that compose reality. When you're looking at novels, when you're performing literary analysis, what you're doing is saying there are these different figures in a novel, and one thing you can do. There are an infinite number of things that you can do, and when you're writing about literature, but you can look at how the different characters in a novel are different expressions of that novelist's psyche and look at how they're relating to one another. And even in a memoir, when someone's talking about real people in their lives, our constructions of others tend to initially be projections. And that's, of course, the task of Jungian and Hillmanian depth psychology, is to, at first, to forge our ego by means of that projection. But then, in an early stage, but then in a more mature stage, it's about withdrawing projection and allowing the other to subsist as genuinely other rather than as a figment in our waking dream.
There's a perfect example for this, and I hate to go back to him, but once again, it's Jordan Peterson. And I mean, allow me to indulge a bit of armchair psychologizing here, but I'm sorry, Adam. We can cut this out, but no, I promise to be fair about this. Well, I mean, let's face it. Jordan Peterson's first book, The 12 Rules for Life, nobody out there is disagreeing that it's great to pet a cat that you meet on the street. Or I would venture to say that a lot of people like to have a clean room, at least now and again, right? I say this only to say that when one affirms a political position, for example, like for Jung or for Hillman, the risk is always there that we can succumb to the sort of shadow dimension or the archetypal dimension of any particular political position, whether it's a Marxist position, a conservative position, or what have you. And just like you're saying, it's through a kind of archetypal projection that we form ourselves, but the problem is remaining in the grip of that and identifying with it, or negatively defining ourselves as somebody like Jordan Peterson does, to the ultimate detriment of his mental health. Right?
Yeah.
This is what I'm saying. I think when we just look at the politics of the matter, I mean, I think there's something fundamentally flawed with Jordan Peterson from the very inception of his fame. But at the same time, I think what happened is he became entangled in the tentacles of that shadow that he projected from the very beginning. And we're seeing the sort of dark fruits of that today. But I think that happens with us more generally, and especially in online spaces where you only have things like tweets or Facebook posts upon which to react to folks. It becomes this hall of mirrors that lends itself to the articulation or the emergence of this shadow. And I think this is a sort of very real way that these things play out. And I think Jungians and Hillmanians are very apt to point out that there is a distinction to be made between the on-the-ground operation and actualization of our political work, for example, and the kind of psychological dangers that any kind of political work engender. That goes for anything. We live amidst this flow of relational fantasies. And I think getting a hold of what's important to us, like what is the frontier of our own personal individuation or psychological development, depends upon, at least in the Hillmanian and Jungian sense, of what archetypes are at play.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's really interesting that I read as much of Peterson's maps of meaning as I could stand. I read the first few introduction in the first chapter or something like that. And this is exactly what he gets wrong. This issue that you're talking about, which is so in Maps of Meaning, he says that the goal of depth psychology, of Jungian depth psychology, is for the light of conscious ego to slay the dragon of the shadow. And with the feminine unconscious shadow, and for the conscious ego to dominate the shadow. And that's completely wrong and backwards, because in reality, in Jungian and Hillmanian depth psychology, the shadow is the compensatory. It's what is repressed by the dominance of the solar light of egoic consciousness, of monocentric egoic consciousness. So you can't have an unconscious unless you have this ego that represses all of these things into the unconscious. They emerged at the same time. And so the dragon that has to be slayed is the ego itself. and its shadow, and then it has to be the ego has to be, it has to die and be reconstituted, devoured and reconstituted in a more pluralist and polycentric mode of relation, for which, and then bringing it back to politics, for which the ego is one voice among a democratic multiplicity of voices, rather than a totalitarian dictator repressing all of the other persons into the shadowy unconscious, where they inevitably return, engage in a return of the repressed as destructive pathologies.
I'm glad you brought in the sort of political dimension. This is kind of where I wanted to push the end of our discussion. Is I see a very strong resonance with Deleuze and Guattari there, and the notion of collective assemblages of enunciation, for example, in the sense that Hillman has this whole thing against the hero archetype that folks in the Joseph Campbell tradition would very much be about, and probably Jordan Peterson for that matter. And I think, when I had my series of nightmares while living in Japan and experienced depression, this was the very point in Hillman's work that kind of pulled me out of that delirium, which was the idea, and this is true for a lot of young men, especially men who grew up in the late part of the 20th century like me. We were just bombarded with hero images, action films, and things like that, to the extent that dose of the very thing that Hillman is railing against, this sort of heroic image. I think, and I could be wrong, and you can correct me on this, Grant, but I think Hillman talks about the myth of Hercules going down to the underworld. And the way that it plays out in Greek myth is that Hercules wants to borrow the three-headed dog Cerberus, and Hades says, yes, you can have him, but you can't bring any weapons to the fight. And so there's this idea of the denuding of weapons and armor to encounter the thing that actually is the protector of the underworld, which is the multiplicity of the unconscious. And so it's through this combat, this sort of naked combat with the three-headed animality, which Hercules in the myth is ultimately successful, but he doesn't kill the animal. He only renders the gatekeeper unconscious, so that the unconscious, the door to the unconscious at large, writ large, can be released. It's in that way that the hero does not become any less of a hero, but he's repositioned in this new way to leave the underworld open, as it were. And this is the sort of paradigm that Hillman wants to usher in. And I think there's a convergence with the way that Deleuze and Guattari want to do politics, this sort of, and maybe even Bataille to a certain extent, in a decapitated manner, in a rhizomatic manner, in an assembled manner with a fringe and a margin, and a pack where wolves can stray away and come back in, be the center for a while, and then not be the center at all.
Yeah, there's that great section where Hillman is talking about how there's been this dominance of the heroic archetypal complex, and that the current task, or at least current in 1970, I think it's still current.
Absolutely.
It's a multi-generational project that we're undergoing here of the ego heroically entering into its own death and rebirth into that polycentric multiplicity. This sense of heroism, it tends to creep back in because, as you said, it's so pervasive in our culture. So even in these sort of spiritual or psychedelic communities, they talk about a heroic dose or a heroic community that's sort of this privileged special community of scholars or practitioners who have this esoteric knowledge. I think that heroism, it's an oppositional separation and forging of the self, of the egoic self in relation to some dominant mode. But I think the ultimate heroism at this moment is to take, I think it's really significant that Freud has tended to permeate academia, especially in the humanities, especially in France, but also in the US and in English departments and art history. And Jung has not really been studied as much within academia, but he's still really dominant in these sort of marginal, liminal, intellectual, therapeutic communities. He's sort of like, I think I say in the book, he's the undisputed king of the margins, or something, like the counterculture, or something like that. So I think, there's this tendency by people who are outside of academia to want to denigrate academia as just this sort of like, nihilist, meaningless, postmodern, empty, socially constructed relativist, cesspool that's just completely pervaded by the demands of capitalism, and it's just there's just this complete rejection of meta narratives. And I think that they were reacting to a tendency that was dominant probably like in the 80s and 90s. But I think that's really changed in the last couple of decades. And I think there's a really a renewed interest among especially younger academics in psychedelics, animism, and even sort of nascently in polytheism and depth psychology and Jungian depth psychology. That's sort of where I'm trying to like position myself in relation to people like you guys and other people that I'm working with, that trying to create a coalition of people who are trying to bring these modes of thought that have almost literally been repressed into the cultural unconscious back into the academic consciousness of culture. And I think one of the most interesting, or the most, I'd say, efficacious places to do that is in Deleuze's relation to Jung, and Deleuze, the influence of Jung on Deleuze, because Deleuze has been so, especially in the last decade or so, he's become so dominant in continental theory in a way that Derrida, I think, was for the few decades before that. But he sort of Deleuze has eclipsed Derrida, I think, in the last 10 years or so. But even so, among Deleuzians and Deleuze-Guattarians, their more negative concepts tend to be emphasized, I think. So the critique of Hegel and the critique of Freud and the Oedipal, and then also their emphasis on rhizomatic multiplicity and things like this. But there are all these other domains having to do with, Deleuze mentions either Jung or one of his concepts in 9 separate texts. So he talks a lot about Jung. And so I think that, and there just really hasn't been that much work done on this relationship. I mean, I think there are like, Christian Karslake did a great book on that talks about that relationship, and also Bergson and Kant. It's Deleuze and the Unconscious. And then there's recently a collected volume by Roderick Mayne called Deleuze, Jung, and the Problematic Whole. So there are, and Barbara Jenkins has a book called Eros and Economy. She looks at the relation between Jung, Deleuze, and Marx. So that's really a great book that I think deserves more attention. So I actually have an article that is actually part of the book, but it still hasn't come out in Deleuze and Guattari studies. I guess it's just they had a backlog of articles, but it's coming out in the next issue, and it's a lot of the material from the book on Deleuze, and from the Deleuze and Hillman chapters, and also I think the beginning of the Jung chapter. And that article is called Differentiating the Depths as opposed to Differentiating, which that's the Deleuzian from difference to repetition, that concept. But the subtitle is a Jungian turn in Deleuze and Guattari studies, and that's a term that I got from Barbara Jenkins, who got it from someone else. So it's sort of like this. I feel like it's percolating out there. Someone posted this blog post I did. It's a shorter version of this article on that Deleuze and Guattari Facebook group. That what's his name? Ian Buchanan, the editor of Deleuze and Guattari studies. And so there was a lot of interest in this, and I have a lot of respect for Ian. He's done a lot for Deleuze and Guattari studies. But he said what he said. I didn't post this article; someone else did. And so he said, "Oh, well, I think a Jungian turn is a bit of a an overstatement." and my response to that was, well, like, a turn doesn't have to necessarily be the dominant the dominant movement in a milieu. It just has to be a significant movement in a milieu. And so I think that's starting to happen. And that's the great thing about that Deleuze and Guattari. One of the great things is that they contain multitudes. They are susceptible to so many different kinds of interpretation, and you can take their work in so many different directions. So I think, yeah, I'd like to see more work done on that, the intersection of those thinkers.
I think you're absolutely right. I think this episode of the podcast will be the turning point for that. And also, I'm doing some writing on Deleuze and Hillman right now, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to talk with you. And actually reading your book made me realize I need to engage with Bergson a little bit more, because you can't do image and imagination without him. And I don't know how much more time you have. We could go 5 hours. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. But maybe one thing that we can kind of close with is, talking about the image in the imagination. I'm thinking about Deleuze's essay in Negotiations, Doubts About the Imaginary. I'm not sure if you remember, or if you're familiar with that particular essay, but it's in that particular essay where he, I think, pushes back in the most, maybe in the most sort of transparent way against the notion of the imaginary, which I think for him constitutes the imagination as a concept. I think he's concerned about making that a thematic operation in his work because it's going to bring representation back in. But then you reference something in the section on Hillman, I believe, or maybe it's on the section on Deleuze, where he talks about a later letter that I think was written in 1982 about Bergson, where he affirms Bergson's notion of the independence of images. And I haven't chased that hair back yet. If you recall that, could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's from that. He's referring to matter and memory, and the imaginal is one of the dominant motifs in matter and memory. I mean, I think one thing about Deleuze, he admitted that he wasn't consistent, even within difference and repetition. He wasn't. He said, Guattari and I, we're not after coherence or consistency. We're after the creation of concepts. They're pioneers who are trying to open up new domains of thought. And, in difference and repetition, he sort of denigrates the imaginal in one part of it, but then he also says that it's something to the effect that true repetition takes place
in the imagination.
The imagination. So,
right.
So it's like, I think Deleuze does this a lot, where he sort of rejects sort of the standard version of a concept, but then reappropriates that concept in a deeper register. So he does that with the ideas, the Platonic or Kantian notion of ideas, and situates them in a more relational, the ungrounding ground of difference. That's one thing that really was challenging for me as I read through Deleuze's work, is that it really changed me, and I think it does this for a lot of people, which is that he challenges all of your certainties in a similar way to Derrida, but whereas Derrida, that's what he does. He challenges your certainties, and he problematizes things, and he leaves you in this state of really complex and sophisticated uncertainty. You're not really sure where you stand, but you know that you don't have this sort of objective, transcendent grounding that you can stand on. And I think Deleuze does the same thing, but then he offers this just, efflorescent bestiary of concepts that are in the constantly shifting complex constellations. And he activates the imagination, but he always, I think it's in part just who he is, but I think it's also a strategy. And it's how he's become so dominant within academia, while also taking up some of these very Jungian concepts, is that he doesn't let you rest on there's the answer. We've attained reconciliation. He leads you into this more open domain, and then he problematizes it and even contradicts himself. But I think he does that in order to unsettle. He doesn't want us, and I think Jung did sometimes have a tendency to go toward this archetypal fullness, toward this sort of totalizing reconciliation of opposites, which I think German philosophy had tended more toward that, like, with German idealism. And, I was thinking the other day about how I think the French were really pioneers in terms of Enlightenment rationality. So how did they become the ultimate avatars now of sort of those domains that exceed rationality? And I think a lot of it honestly has to do with the history of the 20th century, in which they were, invaded by the Nazis, who sort of took this totalizing tendency that was sort of implicit in Kant and Hegel, although I don't think that was ever, or even Nietzsche. So Nietzsche, I think the Nazis completely misappropriated some of Nietzsche's concepts. I mean, I think he flirted with sort of fascism and anti-Semitism. But anyway, my point is that I think French philosophy in the post-war era is in large part, it's really deeply influenced by German philosophy, especially Heidegger and by Freudian psychoanalysis, but also it's in strong reaction against. I mean, Hegel was sort of the monumental figure that this whole generation of French philosophers were. I think Deleuze even says that this whole generation had this monumental father complex in relation to Hegel. And so that puts, the anti-Oedipal critique in a new light, because the Oedipal triangle, they explicitly equate the Oedipal triangle, triangulation of mommy, daddy, me, with the triangulation of the Hegelian dialectic. And so it's just all bound up in this operation of negating the dominance of the father complex associated with Hegel, and negating Hegel, but thereby freeing thought from this monocentric Oedipal dialectic.
Adam, do you have anything before we wrap up? Because I know you've been percolating back there.
I mean, I could go on a long Malibuian sort of rant about how Hegel needs to be freed from himself, but no, I think you summarised it perfectly there in terms of how we get to so much about plasticity and spective abrogation and like.
It almost seems like this conversation needs to have a part 2 or something, or maybe like a Q&A with you on a live stream, or like if you wanted to come back and do something like that in the future, that might be something cool. But before we wrap up, I really want to plug your book, and I want to get the title right. It's Integration and Difference, Constructing a Mythical Dialectic. One of the reasons this book is very useful, even to me and Adam, is that we are in focused ways and kind of inchoate ways working on bringing together these strands with Schelling, Deleuze, Hillman, and so forth. And the one thing your book provides is not only an expounding of these concepts, but actually very nice summaries of all the work that we're working on. So if you're interested in anything that Acid Horizon is doing, especially between Adam and myself, this book could be a centerpiece or a way to start off with a lot of the things that we're interested in.
You're not really gonna get a summary of you're really a summary of the grounding of positive philosophy anywhere else. In terms of like this was like a really good way of getting into that text. I mean, it's especially I see there's a bit of a Schelling revival happening in some corners of the theoretical internet. All the Schelling stuff is in the Hegel Studies collection, which is a bit frustrating to any Schellingians, but this is really fun, especially for Hillman as well. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you guys so much. I mean, that means a lot to me that you took the time to read my work, and I'd love to do a part 2, and let's talk, because this is I mean, it's so enjoyable to talk with guys like yourself who know the references, and this is fun for me. So we should
also
do this
check out Mythical Conscious Happy Hour. I know you went on their show as well, our comrades in arms. So obviously people want some more. absolutely head over there.
Yeah, and I'll link that discussion in our in the show notes so that people can hear more by you. Is there anything that you want to plug? I know you said you're working on something.
I mean, just kind of what I'm thinking about right now. I'm working on a book about Isabel Stegners, an introduction to her whole oeuvre. And so, I think for me, Isabel Stegners, who's, she's, I think, 74 now. To me, she's, one of the most important heirs to both Deleuze and Whitehead, who's another one of my favorites. So I'm deeply involved with her earlier texts right now, which, that would be interesting to talk about at some point, but she's great. And Deleuze even really appreciated her work. There's a lecture that he gave, I think it was in 1987, where she was in attendance, and he said something to the effect of, so he was discussing the relation of Whitehead and Leibniz, and I think he had either just published The Fold or he was about to publish The Fold, which is on Leibniz, and there's a chapter on Whitehead in there, and he says, I need to take advantage of Singer's presence because she's here today and she won't be here in the coming weeks, because she really knows Leibniz and, she really knows Whitehead. And so, yeah, it's like, it's one thing to notice that most of the figures we've talked about have been men.
Yeah.
And so we talked about Malibu,
yeah,
who's great. And I need to read more Malibu. She's amazing. If people are wanting to help problematize that dominance of, I think Stegners is a great place to start. And if people are looking for a place to start, her essay, Beyond Conversation, in the book, what is it? It's Process and Difference by Catherine Keller. That's a great essay. Or her somewhat recent book, Another Science is Possible, or Capitalist Sorcery, that she wrote with Philippe Pignard, which is, if you're interested in the intersection of Marxist critique of capitalism and, animism and witchcraft, that's
that's
great.
Let me throw another one on there, actually. Patricia McCormack's work on Deleuze and demonology, very much contiguous of this line of thought, which has come out recently.
Cool. Yeah, I need to check that out. Sure.
Yeah, one thing, and that this is the perennial issue. If you're into this stuff that we're into, there's a lot of dudes in it, right? And one of the things actually that we're working on, and hopefully maybe some people listening could help us out with this, we have a Bataille reading group behind the scenes. And we've noticed there's a lot of women doing work on Bataille, and we're trying to organize kind of like a little lecture series of women working on Bataille. And so if you're listening right now and you know somebody who's doing important work, or if you are one of those people, feel free to reach out to us.
We need to articulate critique of unconditionality, because it's incredibly phallic Bataille. There's a logic that's not quite fatal, but the sun becomes too phallic for me, even when it's an anus, I'll say that.
Well, with that said, that's a good place to end this episode. Grant, I want to say thank you for coming on, and we'll definitely be in touch with you again.
Great. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me. This has been a blast.
All right. Take care. We'll see you.
Take care.
We'll see you.
Take care.
We'll see you.
Take care.
We'll see you.
Take care.
We'll see
Take
you.
care.
We'll see
Take
you.
care.
We'll see